Hey guys, I'm back again and welcome to what is going to be a multi-part series about creating a game with Graphic Adventure Creator. Now that's for text adventures. It's something that I loved as a kid and I'm trying to make a new one, partly as an example of how to code with GAC, but mostly because I think it's about time I coded a new game. So let's get straight into how you code with GAC in this short tutorial. Graphic Adventure Creator is a powerful text adventure creation tool from the 1980s. Released on Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, and a few other systems, it allowed relatively powerful and in-depth text adventures to not only be created with a far lower cost, but also allowed relatively simple porting of those adventures between the popular systems of the day. Instead of spending time learning a programming language and building your own text parser in order to allow players to interact with your story, you could instead load up Graphic Adventure Creator, or GAC as it quickly became known, and get straight into crafting your adventure game, using its built-in and surprisingly versatile scripting language to help you put your game together very quickly. Simple games could be put together in an afternoon using GAC. I used to knock out a fun little game over a weekend and then share them with my Amstrad-owning friends at school. Longer and more complex games took longer to produce, of course, but the method of crafting a game was the same for a complex one as it was with a simple one. GAC could compile out adventure games that would load on their own without the need to run GAC first. This meant you could create standalone adventures to either give away to your friends or host in public domain libraries, as many of mine and a lot of other people's were, or even sell them commercially if you thought they were good enough to charge money for. As a result, many popular games from the golden age of text adventures were created using GAC, such as The Smirking Horror, Yarkon Blues 1 and 2, Dungeons, Alchemists, Amethysts and Everything, Poltergeist, Spy Track, and so many more. I first got hold of a copy of GAC via issue 76 of Amstrad Action magazine, which I had started reading monthly only a couple of issues beforehand. It came as the first program on Action Pack 10, their 10th regular cover-mounted cassette. At this point in my gaming life, I was very much a fan of text adventures, having spent a lot of the previous school holiday plowing through games like Level 9's Scapegoat with my then best friend. The thought of being able to create my own games was a powerful one, so I set about copying the cover tape to disc. Thankfully, Amstrad Action's tapes came with a simple inbuilt method of doing that, while I devoured the scant information provided in the magazine on how to code for this fascinating software. My first adventure game, which I recall naming Advent 1, was completed on the first night. It sucked. So did the next one, and the one after that, but I persevered. Over the next few months, Amstrad Action printed more guides on how to create games with GAC, and their regular adventure game column started hosting some good Q&A sessions on GAC coding. They even ran a competition to create a standalone adventure game based on their adventure columnist character, the Balrog. I planned to enter, but never finished the game I was planning to submit. I've written a lot of text adventures with GAC, most of them eventually being either deleted for being terrible or stocked with the public domain library that I ran at the time. I recently found some old stock tape cassettes and discs of my PD library, so some of the old adventures have been found. When I try to play them now, they aren't very good at all. I'm planning to take some of the better ideas from them and to remake the games, but that's likely to be a project for the long winter evenings if it happens at all. Today, we are going to start afresh with a new game. This one is based on a plotline for a role-playing game I ran in Second Life, the virtual world that was once touted as the next big thing, and which is now a shadow of its former self, as often happens with these things. The original game I ran was a 12-part epic run once a month for a year. I'm going to distill it down to 6 parts, and release each part as a standalone episode that, when put together, forms an overarching storyline. This video is about creating the first of those 6 games, so let's get started. The first thing any adventure needs is a plotline. You need to know who your player is going to be and what they will need to do in order to win the game. This can be anything you want. Some of the best adventure games have relatively simple end objectives. For example, in Scapegoat, you have to solve the crime that led to your murder. In Colossal Cave Adventure, the first adventure game, you have to explore a cave and collect as much treasure as you can. In Zork 1, which is a variant on Colossal Cave Adventure, you have to collect the 20 treasures of Zork, and so on. Given that the game I'm going to design in this video is the first of a 6-part episodic adventure, it needs to have a clear goal that can be resolved within the episode, plus a setup for the next part. That means the goal of the game has to be very clear, while there can also be some plot points that we can leave to be resolved for later. I'm going to base the game on the first episode of the original 12-part role-playing game, because it was very self-contained and had a clear objective in mind. The setting is a desert planet, and the player will take on the role of a space and time traveling explorer who picks up a distress call from the planet. The goal will be to resolve the situation that caused the distress call to be activated. Now, we know what our plot is and the goal the player will be working toward, so we can begin designing the adventure. We're going to need a map to work from because text adventures commonly take place in a series of rooms in which the player will discover a number of puzzles to solve as they work toward their final goal. Adventure games don't have to be set in multiple rooms, of course. You can have a very good adventure set entirely in one room if you write it well enough, but that's probably a topic for a future video. For now, we're going to go down the traditional route of using multiple locations, traditionally referred to as rooms because of the stereotypical opening line of any location description being, "you are in a room," and we'll see how we go from there. So let's draw out our map. First of all, I know the main focus of this episode will be a crashed spaceship. It's going to be a reasonably small spaceship because I don't want the player to get lost, and I want to keep this opening episode quite focused. So let's draw the ship. It crashed in a desert. So let's have a few rooms of desert, where the player can wander around for a bit just to set the scene. I also need the player's time and space transport vehicle, since they won't be able to leave at the end of the adventure if we don't have it. And that's it. That's our map, for now at least. There's always a possibility that we will need other locations as we develop the story. As it stands, this is what we will work with for the moment. As you can see from the map, I've already worked out that some parts of the map will only be accessible if certain puzzles have been solved. I've jotted down some notes on those puzzles here to remind myself of them later. This will be useful when I'm working on the game code using GAC's own scripting language. Now that we have our map and a few ideas on the initial puzzles, we can start looking at GAC itself. The software is very simple to use, employing a nice and clear set of keyboard commands to navigate a series of menus. Don't let this fool you though. GAC is incredibly powerful when you know how to use it, and while the menus are clear right now, once you start coding, you're going to need to know what you've put where and how you intend to use it. To that end, I recommend keeping a notebook or a few pieces of blank paper with you while you work on the game, so that you can look back at it for reference. The reason for this is simple. Every room, every item, every message, be it an item description, response to a command, or even the end of game congratulations screen, is referred to by a number using GAC's scripting language. If you put the wrong number in your code, you'll get yourself into a huge mess. So jot down each number you use for everything that you put in the game, and you can quickly refer back to your notes to keep yourself on course. Trust me, I speak from experience on this one. If you don't keep clear notes, you'll end up with an unworkable mess of a game, and it's often easier to scrap it entirely and start again than it is to try and fix it. Now, I mentioned items and messages, didn't I? You can code all of these yourself, but thankfully, you don't have to. Most adventure games have some common responses that players have come to expect. If you're starting from scratch, you'll be expected to input everything from saying the equivalent of "I don't understand" when the player mistypes a command, to saying "okay" or something similar when they type in something properly, and then moving on to actually scripting your game. The thing is, GAC has you covered for all that, so don't worry about it. When it was originally released, GAC came pre-packaged with a few small example adventure games to show you how the software worked and to give you an idea of how to build your own games. It also came with a handy file called QuickStart. QuickStart is not an example adventure. It's simply a set of common messages and commands that cover the basics that all adventure games are expected to have built in. Things like moving along the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Get, drop, look, examine. Commands like that. Okay, I don't understand, and are you sure messages, and the equivalents, and other things like that. As its name suggests, QuickStart is there to give you a quick start to game coding, so it's what I'm going to load up first before I put finger to keyboard and start making my game. We load the QuickStart file from the main menu using the T command, which I always thought of as the tape command, even though I was running everything from disk, because it's easier than thinking of T as the "we already used L for something else" command. Now QuickStart is loaded, let's take a look at the commands that GAC has to offer. They're pretty straightforward, and the majority, if not all of them, are listed in Part 3 of the GAC tutorial from Amstrad Action, meaning that you are waiting a couple of months to get this if, like me, you hadn't bought the booklet that Amstrad Action had been trying to flog you. No wonder my first of a few adventures sucked. I had almost no idea how to make a game with this program. Commands in GAC follow a very simple, near-English scripting language. The average command takes the form of if, conditions, actions, end. The conditions can be anything from verb, where GAC checks for whether one of your designer set verbs, aka the commands that a player will enter during gameplay, has been entered, or here, where GAC checks whether one of your designer set objects is in the same room as the player, to actually rather complex and very useful conditions such as and, not, or, and XOR, which are really useful for checking whether puzzles have been solved yet. We will be making a lot of use of those conditions when putting our game together. The actions are the standard results that you would expect, everything from a look command, which prints the description of the current room the player is in, to more gameplay assisting commands, such as swap, to exchange object A for object B without the player being told about it. That's very useful if you need to fill or empty a container, for example, and con, which checks whether there is a connection between room A and room B, very useful for allowing puzzle-locked doors to open or close. As I mentioned earlier, GAC has a very English-like scripting language, but there are some oddities that need to be addressed. For a start, you can only have one set of conditions in each script before things start getting complex. Yes, you can use the and, or, XOR, and not command to string conditions together. For example, you could script an examine command by linking verb with avail commands, like so. If verb X and avail Y, mess Z, end. So when the verb to examine X is entered along with the object Y, and the object Y is available, which in GAC terms means it's either in the same room as the player or the player is carrying it, a message Z is displayed. That's very simple. But what if you wanted something more complex? What if you want to be able to recite a scroll to print some flavor text, pause the game for a second so that the player can read the text, then teleport the player to a new location because it turns out the scroll was a teleport scroll? That requires a bit more to the script, so let's take a quick look at how that would work. If verb X and avail Y, mess Z, hold A, go to B, end. Okay, that looks like a bit of a mouthful. It's worth noting that commands are simply typed one after the other without anything more of a delineation than a simple space. In most programming languages, you would need a colon or a semicolon between commands to keep them apart from one another. Not here. GAC simply doesn't care. As long as you've got your object and room numbers, etc. in brackets when you need them, you're good to go. Also, if you really need to make sure the player is carrying the scroll when they read it, you can swap out avail Y for car Y, and that will make sure the command only works when the scroll is being carried. If you do that, you'll want to write a second command to make sure the player understands that they are supposed to be carrying the scroll. Maybe something like this. If verb X and not car Y, mess Z, end, where the message Z is something like, you are not carrying the scroll. It's a little more complex on the condition side, but once you get used to how GAC works, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, that got a little complex, but we are definitely getting somewhere now that we have a map and a handle on how to script in GAC. So let's start putting our game together. We'll start by creating the game's starting room. Now there are two ways that we can do this. We can either put the player straight into the game by setting our starting room as the player's ship's control room over near the top right of our map, or by creating a special welcome room that welcomes the player to the game and requires them to type a command to begin the game. I'm going to go with the latter, because it lets me offer the player the chance to read some background information before they start getting into the game, without having to break the player out of their suspension of disbelief in order to do some admin. When you create your game, you can start it any way you want, of course. We'll begin by pressing R from the main menu to start coding our rooms. It's tempting to begin with room 1, because that seems logical, but since I'm starting with a welcome room, I'm going to put that at the end of the list of available rooms, so I can maintain a logical progression of room numbers when I start numbering them from my map. GAC allows 9,999 rooms, so I'm going to start the welcome room as number 9,999. This will keep it well out of the way of the rest of the game's rooms, so I'll have no worries about accidentally creating a situation where the player can walk into it. Here I'm going to enter the welcome text that I want. If I want to change it later, I can do so by coming back into the room editor from the main menu and typing 9999 again. Once the description is entered, I press the enter key again. GAC will then ask me for a list of connections. This is the set of commands the player can enter in order to move from here to the main game. I'm going to set the only available exit as south, so the player can simply type S to begin the game. We do that by typing S1, so GAC knows that if the player tries going south, they should be moved to room number 1. As an alternative, you could have set no connections at all and required the player to type start or begin or something else, but if you did that, you would have to create a verb to go with your choice of commencement command. And that's all well and good if you want to go down that route, but here's the deal with doing that. GAC can only code with 255 commands, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can use them all up. I've decided not to waste a command that I might need later, although if you know that you can spare one, feel free to go right ahead and use the custom command route to begin your game. So anyway, I'm then asked if I want to link a graphic to this run. We haven't created any graphics, and given that my ability to draw using the cursor keys is next to non-existent, I'm probably not going to make any graphics for this game, but if you want to give it a try, feel free. So for now, I'm just going to press the Enter key again to skip entering a number. GAC will then ask me for another run number. I don't want to create another run right now, so I'm going to press the Escape key now to return to the main menu. Why? Because GAC defaults to players starting in run 1, and we don't have a run 1 yet. And even if we did, we don't want the players to start there. We want them to start in the welcome room. So from the main menu, let's press B this time to tell the software where we want the player to start. We get to a simple screen now asking us which run number the player should start in. It's currently set to 1, so let's overtype that with 9999 and press return. Now we are back at the main menu. Press return, which lets you try out your adventure, and you'll see we're taken to the welcome room. Press escape twice to get back to the main menu. Now we need to start creating the first set of rums, and it's here where we actually get into the game creation proper. Because we're writing the rum descriptions, object descriptions, messages about what is happening and so forth, we get to introduce the feel of the game world and let the player get to know our protagonist. But who is our protagonist? We haven't got to that yet, have we? In a text adventure game, you have two main methods of describing the game world. You can take the Dungeon Master route, where everything is introduced as if it was from an omniscient narrator describing everything that you, the player, sees and does. That's good for a standard adventure game, especially one where you want the player themselves to feel like they are the adventurer and they are doing everything in the game. The alternative is to filter everything through the protagonist's character, so the player sees the world through the protagonist's eyes, interacts with the game by telling the protagonist what to do, and seeing the protagonist's responses. It's this method that I'm going to go with because I really enjoy that kind of adventure game where it feels like the protagonist is relaying a story to you about what they did. Scapegoat introduced this method of interactive storytelling to me, and it did it so well that it immediately became my favourite style of adventure game. I loved the atmospheric storytelling and the way that instead of simply typing OK whenever I entered a command in that game, the protagonist spoke to me, the player, as if I was reading a book. For example, a command like get torch wouldn't simply respond with you can't. It would be something like I tried to grab the torch, but my hand passed right through it. Far more evocative, I'm sure you'll agree. So I'm going to go with that method of creating a game because it lets me introduce the protagonist's character. But who is that? As I mentioned earlier, I'm basing this adventure off a storyline that I ran in Second Life. But don't worry, I'm not expecting you to jump into the shoes of my RPG character or anything like that. I mean, I'm a nerd, sure, but I'm not that kind of nerd. Instead, I'm creating a wholly new character for this series of adventures. She's going to go by the codename The Venturer, because why not? She's an adventurer. And to mix things up a little, she's going to be mute, because it will add an extra level of problem to the game when she can't simply phone for help or anything like that whenever there's a problem. She's also going to be a bit of a smartass, which will become very obvious when she starts describing the world that she finds herself in and the items that she comes across. I'm hoping you'll quite like her, because she's going to be the protagonist for this game and possibly the other episodes in the 6-part series too. So anyway, now that we know who our protagonist is and how she's going to be our filter for viewing the world, let's actually get down to writing the locations that we'll visit in this game. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be starting the game in the control room of the Venturer's ship. So let's begin by pressing R on the main menu to open the room editor and select room 1 to edit. GAC doesn't allow for huge amounts of description in a room, so be prepared to keep everything as succinct as possible. Remember that you have 255 messages that you can play with, so with some careful repetition of descriptions here and there, you can always allow the player to examine things that you mention in the room description to get more information and flavor text. For my part, I plan to repeat the message when the Venturer's ship walls and floor are examined so that the ship has internal consistency to its sparse design. I want the door to the rest of the ship to be locked at the start of the game, so when it comes to adding exits, I'm not going to put it into the connections list. I also don't want to use the standard north, south, etc. movements to enter or leave the ship, so I tried writing out as a command in connections. But guess what? There's no such command as out. We'll have to add that before we go any further. Adding commands to GAC isn't as simple as creating an object, although it is similar. We need to use the verbs menu to add the command to the game's command list, but that won't get us all the way in most cases. You start by adding the command to the verbs list, but if there is no condition attached to it, typing the command will do nothing. Thankfully, we can bypass the addition of a condition script, which we've discussed in detail earlier anyway, because once we set a verb into the verb list, we can add it as an option on the connections list in a room. That's very useful information. It's also worth noting that although you can only have 255 separate verbs, you can double them up. For example, the verb list that you start with if you load the QuickStart file has several doubled up commands such as e and east being on the same command. That's very useful because any player who doesn't want to type in the full direction command can still get on in the game by typing NSEW and so forth. So I'm going to add 2 new verbs at this point, in and out, with enter and leave as alternate versions to account for player preference. Because QuickStart has already entered 16 sets of verbs to the list, I'll be adding these as verbs 17 and 18. Actually, while we're here, let's go ahead and add in 4 more verbs right away so we don't run into problems later on. Let's add in northeast, southeast, and so forth to allow more movement options. These really should already have been in the GAC code when we loaded the QuickStart, but they weren't, so let's just add them and get it sorted straight away. Remember to keep a list of all the extra verbs that you've entered into the game, plus the number associated with them. Do the same with rums, objects, and messages. It will make scripting a lot easier as you go on. Now that I've done that, I can go back to editing the description from rum 1 and add out 2 as a connection to take the player out of the ship when they type in either out or leave. Now let's save our game data just in case and go back to building the rest of the game. We save using the S command on the main menu. We can save either to tape or disk. Personally, I'm going to use disk because it's significantly quicker than trying to save to cassette. You'll be asked whether to save as a data file or as a runnable program. Choose data file because we aren't anywhere near ready to save the game out as a standalone program just yet. Now that's done, I want to address one pet peeve that I have with GAC, the what now prompt. It always irks me, partly because it takes up so much of the screen real estate, but also because it's too in your face for my liking. Thankfully, like so much of GAC, you can customize this prompt to suit your own game. I'm going to change what now to a simple greater than sign prompt. It's obvious to any adventure game player that it's a prompt, and it takes up less space on the screen, so in my view, it's perfect. What now is simply a message that GAC looks for to display whenever user input is required. You'll find it at message 240, so let's press M from the main menu to access the message editor and select message 240 when prompted. Change what now ? To greater than sign space and press return. Okay, let's round this room creation out by coding the locations outside the venturer's ship, i.e. the main area where this episode will take place. By my count, having numbered all of the rooms on the map that I drew earlier, it looks like I'll need to add in 19 rooms in total before I have the area that the player will be able to walk around right from the start of the game. Let's put those rooms in, remembering to keep the location descriptions reasonably simple. Now we have our rooms described, it's time to add in some objects. The interesting thing about objects is that GAC doesn't require them to be present in the room when the player is there in order to interact with them, unless you specifically tell it to, that is. That means we can add a second inaccessible room to the game to store a lot of useful objects, things that we'll want the player to be able to interact with at any time, or in specific circumstances anyway, without the need to fill the room description with so much detail that the player doesn't know where to start. What kind of objects are we talking about here? Well, how about the walls and the floor that I mentioned earlier? If I want the player to be able to examine the floor of the venturer's ship, you might think I would need an object called floor for the player to examine. But that's not actually the case. We'll come back to that in a moment. But for now, let's start with something that I know we will need later, but which can't enter the game right away because it will be hidden from the player until they find it. How do we hide items? Well, the simplest way is to create a room that the player can't access and put all the objects in there until they're needed. Go to the rooms menu again and create a room number 9998, which we'll call the storeroom. Don't add any exits from this room because we won't need any. Now come back to the main menu and press O to access the object creation menu. Create an object 1 because it's our first object and call it a crowbar. Set it to begin the game in room 9998. Now return to the main menu and set the game to begin in room 9998. Enter the game and you will see a crowbar is now in the room with you. But if you type examine crowbar, you'll find that the game says you can't. That's because we haven't set up any of the necessary scripts or told the game what a crowbar is. Why would we need to do that? Because, like verbs, we can have objects referred to by a number of names. That way we don't have to have the player type get a crowbar or examine a crowbar and so forth. We can set the noun for our object to simply crowbar or pry bar. or even bar if we so desire. In fact, we can name it anything we want, but let's try and keep it simple and actually part of the description. The error message also reminds me of something that's important. We need to alter the QuickStart messages to better fit our narrative style. The venturer is describing everything from a first-person perspective and in the past tense, but GAC is sending out messages such as, "You can't do that," which breaks the flow. So let's set up our nouns to go with the object that we just created, and then correct all of those messages. Go into the Nouns menu by pressing N on the main menu, and you'll be presented with a short list like you saw with the verbs. At the moment, all that's there is it as object 255, the last possible object in the game. Type 1 and enter crowbar as a noun. You can also add pry bar as a noun if you prefer. Then return to the main menu. Now we'll need a message to go with the crowbar, something for the player to read if they examine it. Let's go into the Messages menu and start message 1. Notice that I've chosen object 1, noun 1, and message 1. That's to keep things simple when it comes to coding. I want to keep as many of the objects associated with the same nouns and messages that I can, so I don't have to keep looking at my notes for every line of code that I want to script later. Anyway, we're in message number 1, so let's add a description for our crowbar. Now let's take a look at those QuickStart messages, since we're in the Messages menu anyway. QuickStart pre-wrote a lot of messages for us between numbers 239 and 255. Let's go through each of them in turn and change them from talking about the player in the present tense to the venturer talking about herself in the past tense. It'll take us a while, but it's worth doing to maintain the narrative flow when the player is immersed in the story. Once we've done that, let's save our game data again so we don't have to do it all over if anything happens. Re-enter the game and try to examine the crowbar again. What's the matter? Is it still not working? Oh, well, at least the error message is in keeping with the game's style now, yes? Come back to the main menu and let's do our first bit of scripting so that things will work. Press L to access the Low Priority Conditions menu. We need to be in here because although we are setting up our ability to interact with an object, and that object will need to be in the same room as us to do that, the object will be able to move around the game, and therefore the condition that we script can't be room specific. And we'll get to that next time when we start adding the ability to examine parts of our room descriptions and so forth. If we try to edit condition 1, or line number 1 as GAC calls it, we'll see that there's already a script in there. That script is for the look command, so we should probably leave that one alone. Press escape and let's move on to the first available line that we can add some code on, which is line number 8. Type the following: if verb 16 and noun 1, mess 1, end. What does all that mean? Well, it tells GAC that if the player types verb number 16, which corresponds to the examine command, and follows it up with noun number 1, or our crowbar noun, then GAC should print message 1, our crowbar description message, on the screen, then end this line of script and wait for the player to enter another command. Let's go back to the main menu and re-enter the game. Try examining the crowbar now and see what happens. See that? We've just coded our first working piece of code for the game. Well done! Okay, that's enough for one evening's coding, I think. Time we had a rest. Save the data again, and I'll see you next time for more game development with the Graphic Adventure Creator. Okay guys, we've got the rooms and an object. It's not much, but it is a start, and I think that's pretty much all I'm going to cover for this week. Tune in next week and we'll get into a bit more of the game development, and hopefully by the end of next week we'll have some really interesting stuff to show you, so I hope you'll tune in. Okay, that's all I've got for today, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you did like this. If you did, remember to click the like button, share it with your friends so that they'll know how to code a game too, and do subscribe for future videos because there'll be more in the future. But until next time, I've been Zoe Kirk-Robinson, you've been watching GameHammer Extra on the Knob Mouse channel, and I'll see you later.